Hey, what's up, viewer? Welcome to Hour 4 of Day 3 of this Nebulous live development creation series. I'm messing around with the ring radius for the scanning system. I've got a guide for the size of the ring, and I've got the ability for the economy to be spent on a scan, and then when you scan, it sends out a wave. What needs to happen when that wave is created, it needs to be given a mesh renderer. Or excuse me, not a mesh renderer, but a mesh collider. And if the mesh collider runs into scannable elements out in space, it will activate its renderer if it is high enough frequency to scan it all the way. Revealing other space celestials that the player can then essentially send ships to and gather more information about with more investment in scanning and stuff like that. I was also going to fix an issue with defaulting this to 1. It should do this here. That way if I click the radius, it comes out as a scan, as opposed to having to always set these two values. Yeah, you could start a little better like this or something. And then the player can just get an idea of like where they want to go with the scan, and then they can adjust the scan if they want to. And then they deselect and reselect. It should remember to set the defaults properly, which it wasn't doing on play mode start. So I'm going to have to figure out why the initialization is setting it to 0. If I'm not mistaken, even though I set the defaults up to something different. So it's almost correct, but I want this to be like 75. So I'm going to have to investigate why this is working like this. So it isn't on Spawn Celestial. It could be on active scanning elements. Yeah, I don't know of anywhere where it actually initializes these. I was under the impression that these would just default properly. There might be somewhere where I'm initializing it, I'm just forgetting that I initialized it there. So it's defaulted correctly. Its label is not, though. And the tally isn't also. So this was just set to 1 by default. That might make things a little less confusing. And I like this being at like 75, so maybe that would work. They would need to have their default set properly, but they are. $75 doesn't have a halfway, so 74, 37, negative 37.5, 37.5, which I know is specific, but so we'll see if it actually will work now. And not quite. That's fine, but it's weird how it sets it to 360 to begin with. That time it's set to 0. So there are places where it's setting itself to 0. Okay, so maybe it's in player, makes a new active selection. I may be able to default the values here. So anytime it's a new selection, it'll just be at min value equals negative 37.5 float, and then max value equals 37.5 float. And this may set it up properly. Almost. The radius is still calculating the wrong value by default until the ring gets turned here. But if we deselect, we reselect, it is defaulted. But if I deselect, it's set to 0. So oh, this does have this going on. Might as well slide that in there. So then here we want this to be 1. We do want these to be this part. Man, my cousin, or my nephew's got the cops bad right now. He usually doesn't get the coughs. Alright, so this actually looks correct. There's still one more issue that I keep running into, which is that the ring is starting at 360 degrees. Which leads me to believe the and let's see, if I select the sun, it clears. If I go back, it's basically the same. If I deselect like this, come back, I can just use the scanner. So I'm wondering if I might have a button to open and close the UI for active scanning or something, as opposed to having it over here. I'll have to think about it. So I'm just gonna fix the one other issue, which is that it doesn't have the proper value when it does its first radial increase for some reason. For some reason the radius gets maxed, or the angle gets maxed for some reason. I'm not sure though where perhaps that has something to do with the instantiation of it. Okay, so here the scanning ring . Alright, so active scanning radius object is just a game object. Active scanning radius. Basically, on initialization, or whenever the scanning ring initializes, it has to match its Okay, so then when the ring is instantiated, which was a or no, it wasn't a scan form, it was a scan ring. Scanning radius. Okay, so in this instance, it seems like... Oh, but it's prefab, isn't it? I basically need to just readjust these to 75, or to negative 37, 37. For the start and end angles. Which would require a for loop to take the ring measurements and I need to do work on their start angle and their end angle. And the start angle needs to equal just negative 37.5. The end angle just needs to equal 37.5. And the ring will build, not being maxed out for whatever reason. And it will just match the default radius, or get changed. So we select and increase the radius. Okay, so now we don't have it starting at the wrong angle, so we can just zoom out and... Uh-oh, so now we have another issue. Now we lost our radial control. If I change the range and then... Nope. Okay, so I messed something up, that's for sure. Oh, so I did this wrong. I want this to be only on start, not every time the mesh needs to build. Alright, so okay, we're back to normal. If 75 is too large, they can scooch it down some. Oops. Yep, that some kind of weird timeout event. It's my best idea for that. So let's see here. I mean, the scan works basically. There's, or I guess it's not completely done. There's one issue here where it climbs to 0 and counts through 0 twice, which is a little weird. The idea is that it's, oh, it's, I'm not really sure why that's happening, but I'm really not sure about that one. The other thing is we have to add a mesh collider to the active player scan prefab. And this collider, let me see here. I don't know, sure. It's technically both, if you depending on which angle you're looking at it. It is technically a trigger. It does not have a physics material. It does have a mesh, which is our mesh. So active scan form, for instance. Oh shoot, I did that wrong. I'm trying to move it up here. Basically, active scan form needs to handle or I might not need to do that in here. I'll have to see if I can trigger something by just increasing the size of, I at least have to assign the mesh. And if it's a shared mesh, maybe I can, still this would be the place to do it. And I also have to say get component mesh collider, a shared mesh, and I'm hoping that will actually put a mesh collider on there that is physically accurate to our geometry. And just scale it for us because we've connected the mesh that changes. So let's see if I can trigger something. So it may be better to add a scan sorry, my cat's making weird sounds and stuff. Sorry, I'm getting a little thrown off here. I've simply got to make sure that trying to think about how to trigger the collision with something. The other thing I can do is run it real fast, see if I can just visualize the collider changing in size properly. It actually didn't even assign the mesh when I entered. Oh, it hasn't spawned yet. Well, the other cat's kind of tripping too. It's funky weather out right now. So if I run this scan, uh-oh. I have not seen that before. So an instantiation, it is in fact not properly assigning the mesh. Let's inflate mesh. It's deprecated anyway. So my only other idea would be to go like this. Because at this point mesh should be initialized. It should work anyway, to be honest. See if it makes a difference though. It's super strange. Must have 3 distinct vertices, but I'm sure it has 3 vertices. So that's my idea for assigning a mesh. Collider mesh is not working actually. Mesh must have at least 3. Mesh must have at least 3 distinct vertices. And that may be because it's a convex mesh. Okay, so I guess the reason this is happening is because I'm only using 2 rings. And that means that I only have a surface. I don't have a volume for a mesh collider by geometric definition. Even though it's got 2 sides, because I've got the shader graph rendering both sides. But instead I need to use geometry on both sides to get the mesh collider to use it, I think, is what's going on. So I'm going to have to go into the, let's see here. Maybe it's in the actual prefab. Okay, yeah, oops. Just going to have to add 2 more rings here. I'm going to have to reformulate, oh, and I'm going to have to go into the shader graph of this and turn off its, I'm going to have to turn off the double-sided mode. And then I've got to set up these rings so that the ring is 2-sided. To do that, perhaps It might take 5 rings actually. And essentially we will go with a diamond. So we've got -1, to 0, -1 to, kind of throw darts here, like 0.1, go to the right one, in which case then we'd want 0.1 here, and we would have to make sure then that we go back to the left at this point, x, whoops, sorry, -0.1x, and then we would be back in the 4th ring to where we started, which was -y, or y -0.1. And this will create a ring which is, it's actually a ring that's a diamond. It's a square that's turned to be a diamond, essentially. And it should still all work the same. I might have to tweak the directions if I sequenced them incorrectly. But if I do this, it should assign the mesh collider because it'll have it'll have a real 3D form, and I think that's what it was complaining about. So here we go. Let's see if that's the case. And okay, so that time the scan did not. Okay, so I think the mesh sequencing is backwards, possibly. So let's try going to -x. To 0.1x. Back to the original. This might sequence it properly. Alright, so I'm definitely messing up something pretty hard. The original idea just sequenced 2 rings. Okay, so this still makes sense. And then it just builds rings from a... So it's using stacked rings. I mean, I should be able to just do... Man, I'm not sure what to do here. It's kind of getting me. For some reason it worked pretty good with the shader graph approach. I just had 2 rings, and those were just one on top of the other. Which is all I was trying to do here was say... like... all that changes to what was the height. And something else handled the radius, whereas in this situation, the ring's radius all have to change. Man, I still feel like it should basically be what I'm doing here. Let me see which values change. And I select the scanner. The radius is still 0. The angles are like this. Let me see if I run the scan. Does it actually... whoops, that just... Okay, so that just ran the scan. What the heck? It even looks a little different too. And that's actually why it's funky on the end, because it's a triangle with no cap on it. Alright, so does that mean that these actually have... Okay, so the mesh collider has a mesh. Okay, so here's what needs to happen for this. For testing's sake... Well, I guess it doesn't have to be for testing's sake. What's the... Okay, so the deal is that what we need is the active scan form needs to use a collider hook. So what, on collision enter, or on trigger enter? Enters a trigger, but this one is a trigger, so on collision enter, collision. You're just going to say debug log. Instead of writing debug log, I can in fact put a breakpoint there. If I just say var test test ++. I would just say in test then. In ++ equals 0. Whatever I gotta do to get the debugger started. And then we'll just go like this. And I guess I shouldn't do this yet. I have to put an object in, a test object in. So I've got to grab a new celestial and place it in the starting system. And it needs to be within a couple units of starting planet once this compilation ends. So we'll grab a planet prefab. We add one more here. I guess we need to say +1. And then drop this one here. Man, it's not letting me, it doesn't want me to add a new one. I think that's weird. Oh, it's because I'm not adding it to the prefab list. Dir. I do need this going on. And the capital is this one, 5-3. So let's say like, or no, it's not. The capital is the first one, -2, -2. So this last element can be like -6, -8. And it will probably spawn close enough to be scanned. As long as the planet has a collider, I need to check. And it does have a sphere collider. So let's see if the debugger will trigger this collision. And in that instance, it did not trigger it. So let me turn on the planet and see where it is. Okay, so it is inside of the scanning radius. And it is so okay, so now it should still be hitting it, but it is not triggering any on collision enter. The other thing I could think of is maybe try on trigger enter. I might need to stop the debugger for that. I guess I could also check that the prefab I can also check if the prefab is correct for I guess that was the prefab, wasn't it? For the active player scan prefab. It is convex and it is a trigger. Okay, so let's get this another shot. And bump the range, bump the radius. Oh, a little bit of a defaulting issue. So I know it's like over here somewhere. and it's just not triggering it. Either that or it is triggering it and I'm just not triggering it in the debugger for some reason. Okay. Sometimes when it freezes up like on me like that, the recording does as well. So it might have skipped out for a split second. So I'll just say triggered. And double check on both of these whether or not it triggers. Okay. Because I am trying to just write in a hook to one of these, where if the scan form hits something, it doesn't do any physics collision, it just acts as a trigger, as on a pass-through. On collision, intertype collision. Oh. So one's a collider, one's a collision. Let's see if we can get these running. And I don't get anything. I know it's passing through the plane. The radius is only 0.5, but what if I do the scan with it turned on? Still nothing. Pretty sure it's on the same level. 0. It's on 0. And the radius is correct as well. So off the top, what if I do this? This is where locking, being able to lock a target might make sense. It still didn't work, okay, so the other thing I could consider is making the active scan not convex, or not, at least start with not a trigger. Let's see if the collision will take this time. Still nothing coming out of that. So what if we turn off convex? It says cleaning the mesh failed. Once again, cleaning the mesh failed. Interesting. Alright, so I'm not sure what's up. That's all correct. The mesh is the same mesh. Okay, so if I'm looking at the scene view, it almost looks like the mesh collider is stuck over here, actually. See, that's proper. Okay, so that's what I'd rather see, is that it's triggered. And then it's definitely not, well, I guess it doesn't really matter. But it should be moving through this, no problem. So it should basically be working, I mean. So I'm like messing up my hooks or something. Which I don't think I am. So since I can't get it working this way, the only other idea I've got is I've got to make the planet have a collider result. Let's see, we will do... You know what, there was one other thing I wanted to try. Hold on. The other thing I wanted to try was dropping a prefab into the scene view and then starting play mode. To check if it's got something to do with instantiation. Messing up something. So I basically know where the planet was. I can put it in a spot similar, so -6, 6. Yes, that one should be showing up automatically. It's a little weird. Alright, so this isn't going to work. Let's set the put on the outside. Position's fine. And let's see if I can hit this sphere collider. by using a pass-through. So then get the debug logs. Even through this planet. What if I turn it as a trigger? Still nothing, I don't know, man. I can't get it to trigger off the mesh collider. But it said the trigger mesh collider was working. Oh, I have to set it to is triggered by prefab. And let me give it another shot then. So maybe I was just messing it up. And so if I scan this one, I don't get any callbacks. If the planet is a trigger, I also don't get any. The only other idea I've got is that the active scan object. Okay, so here's my idea basically. See if I can grab it in time. So my idea is that this active player scan will trigger it if I move it manually as an object. Darn, it didn't work. Or let's see if I go like this, if it works. So it still don't work anyway. I'm a little flat here, to be honest. So I guess the last thing I'm gonna have to try, the last thing I can try is the celestial body has to or the planet script has to actually so this didn't matter. I guess it's just like basically the planet just has to have a certain collision component. Which I suppose is a scanning deal, even though it goes on the planet, is the thing. So I'd rather maybe call it something like planet active scanner, active scan wave hits celestial. And essentially, at least at the time though, I'm running at, got about a minute left here. Maybe I can make this work. So active scan wave hits celestial, it's the same thing. We're trying to take our both of these and see if we can just get a collision happening. Nothing else really. So we'll double click and add this. And then that'll change the prefab that spawns by default. And then we will just see if this works. Of about 1 hour, so we're going to do this quick, and if it doesn't work on the first try, I'm going to cut the video for now, since it's at 1 hour. Alright, so let's see, the angle was maxed, and this way. And there was a prefab over here, so let's see if this scans and hits anything. Nothing. If the planet is trigger, what if I do it like this? Still nothing. Alright. I'm gonna have to figure it out in the next video. I've got to sort this out before detecting collisions. It's very important. So thank you for checking this out, and hope to see you in the next video. Take care.